Here we go. Well, happy Wednesday, everybody. We're so glad you chose to join us today. I know carving an hour or so out of your day is not always easy to do, so we appreciate the time you're spending with us. Again, this is Brantley Pearce. I'm a Director of Client Solutions here at Work Institute. But today I have joining us our President, Danny Nelms. Danny, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Brantley. It's been a busy few weeks, to say the least, but excited to be here today, excited to be participating in this and a topic that I am, as you know, very, very passionate about.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to start. Since I've been here, you've always been very passionate about this specific topic. I know it is kind of a core of what we do here. I'd love to hear more about that. Why do you care so much about exit interviews?
Well, probably because I've made every mistake you could ever make when it comes to exit interviews. Obviously, for those of you that don't know my background, I spent about 20 years of my career in HR, kind of in all areas, and have done exit interviews in a variety of different ways. And one of the cool things about meeting Dr. Tom Mahan, who founded the Work Institute, and then working here was, really studying how things should be done. And I find it sort of fascinating how little time we do look at what's the science behind various things. What does the research tell us? And, there's just so much noise out there from consultants, from marketers, from, all these different places. And yet we don't really go and look at what does the actual science say? What does the research say? What independent research has been done? And so it's something that we're very passionate about here at the Work Institute. Now, we don't live in a perfect world, so everything can't be done exactly the way that the research would tell us all the time. We have to be practical about some things, but really excited about talking about this from the perspective of what does the research tell us?
Yeah, and you and I, we have this conversation, I feel like, pretty regularly about when it comes to employee feedback. Oftentimes folks kind of default to the easy button, kind of what can I do quickly, easily, nimbly, and that's great. That's totally understandable. I know I often find myself in a case where I'm just looking for an easy button, but when it comes to employee feedback, it's kind of that garbage in, garbage out philosophy, right? You want to make sure that you're taking the best approach. So we'll spend some time today talking about that, how to take that right approach, and asking you some questions. But when you and I were talking about this, these top 5 mistakes made in exit interviews, we kind of realized we needed this foundational question of why do exit interviews matter? So could you talk a little about that? I know it's kind of a topic of debate in the employee feedback realm.
It really is, and I'm hearing so much now about why do we even do exit interviews? Why do exit interviews matter? Why are we, that it's too late, that this is just an autopsy, and why is that important? And so there's just a lot of conflicting information out there, I think, in terms of why we need to do exit interviews. But for me, and let's put a fancy word on it. Exit interviews are a predictive analytic, and that's one of those big terms. We talk about big data. We talk about being able to predict things and predictive analytics. Well, it turns out exit interviews are actually predictive analytic. If we can, learn why people left, the real reasons why people leave, they're actually representative of an at-risk population in your organization currently. And we have shown over and over again, and the research has shown over and over again, that if we act on the reasons why people are leaving, if we take action to fix those problems, identify those issues, whatever those things are, that we're actually going to reduce our employee turnover. So it's actually not, I think sometimes we try and make it more complicated than it needs to be. And it turns out that exit interviews are a really straightforward way of getting good information around why people are leaving. The hard part is the action. I think we're going to get to that at some point today, Brantley, but if we act on that information and we act on it urgently and appropriately, then we're actually going to reduce turnover if that's one of our objectives in why we do exit interviews. So I think they're more important today than they've ever been. For those of you, hopefully a lot of you have read our 2019 retention report, and it turns out, 41 million U.S. workers left their jobs voluntarily in 2018. That's like 27.5% of the workforce.
When I hear that number, it's always almost staggering because I have a hard time kind of fathoming that, like how big a number that is. It's crazy.
And I think we looked that up. Wasn't it like the population of the 25 largest cities in the U.S. or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it is tons and tons of people.
Yeah.
So it's a problem that I think is felt kind of across the board. So hopefully today in these kind of 5 common mistakes, we help make your life a little bit easier as it pertains to those high turnover figures. So Danny, what in your book, let's just jump into it, is mistake number 1 made as it relates to exit interviews?
Well, this is mistake number 1, and it's also probably the biggest mistake. But it's also that one going back to this idea of practicality that's really difficult, I think, for organizations. And that first mistake is actually related to timing. One of the things that we've learned through some and not super scientific research, but just some surveys that we've done over the years, is it looks like somewhere around 80% of all companies actually do some sort of exit interview, and they do it on or before the last day of employment. And so, whether it's an HR person, whether it's a supervisor, but they're doing an exit interview, they're doing it in that last week or that last day of employment, or they're deploying some sort of internal exit survey through some sort of online tool. And it turns out that data may very well be flawed. The research actually tells us that if we do an exit interview at least 2 weeks after the employee leaves, that 40 to 63% of the reasons for leaving are going to be different. And I mean, that's just that means half of the information that we're gathering in that last week employment isn't valid.
Yeah, and we talk about this often, and sometimes it's maybe a 180, it's a totally different reason, but oftentimes we find it's just more specific data, right?
Yeah, and people ask me all the time, because the research says that it's going to be different, and people will say, well, does that mean it's more accurate? Does that mean that they lied the first time around? And I think you make a good point, Brantley. I don't think people lie. I think they sugarcoat it a little,
Sure.
I think that personal reasons, and we've seen this, so someone will leave and they'll fill out some type of survey online, and they'll click personal reasons, right?
Yep.
But if you were to actually do an interview with them 2 weeks later, what you find out is that they were having problems with their manager, or they were, they left because of relocation. And sometimes in that relocation, we find out they're going to work for a competitor.
Right. And I love that personal example there. Again, this is something we talk about often. It was a personal disagreement with their manager, which isn't personal. It's a manager issue. It's not a personal issue per se. And I also love this thought of I've done exit interviews before, and I know when you're in that last couple of days, you're in a pretty good mindset. You think you're going to a better job, you're kind of happy. You don't want to burn a bridge, and there's no reason. Most people, not all, but most people don't think there's a reason to be brutally honest because there's not a lot of upside in it.
Right.
So they just kind of give their canned answer and move on.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about the 2 weeks later is I think people have had a chance to leave. The communication is really important in some sort of an offboarding process where, we do tell the employee, hey, we're going to be conducting an exit interview, or, it's really important that we get information from you. We don't want people leaving. We know there's sometimes good reasons why people leave, but retention is important to us, and we want to know why people are leaving. And then that's why we're actually going to be contacting you in a couple of weeks so that you're in the right frame of mind to give us really good information. So that communication is key. But when you set the stage, then they've been able to get to their old job. They've gotten their last paycheck. They've gotten their commissions or vacation pay or whatever those things are. And typically we just see they're much more objective.
Sure.
And they just feel more free, for lack of a better word, to give you good, honest feedback around what it was like to work there. And by the way, I think the one thing we can't overlook, and I think we might talk about this, is that it's not just about the reason for leaving, but it's all the other things we want to know about too in an exit interview that are really meaningful for us to understand. So timing is by far the number one mistake that people are making. And again, I know this is the hardest one, right?
Yeah.
Is that we think, well, how are we ever going to do an exit interview after they've left? If we want to send out a survey, we don't have their personal email address. There are all kinds of barriers to it. We get it. We understand it. But that's why we work with our clients to help them to figure out how you're going to do it, how you're going to do it properly. And in some instances, maybe the practicality says we can't do it 2 weeks after. Well, how do we make it the best it can be before that time? So it's a worthy conversation to have around this timing issue.
Yeah, and I think the timing topic is kind of the biggest, for lack of a better term, victim of the easy button, right? It's just easier to talk to them while they're there, but that doesn't mean the data you're getting is the quality it needs to be to drive meaningful change.
And by the way, Brantley, and I know we got to keep moving pretty fast, but the number one thing that we hear about is response rates.
Sure.
You know, because if you try and do an exit interview or a survey before they've left, sure, you can get 100% response rate or 90% response rate. Yeah. If they do it after they leave, you're almost never going to get that high percentage. It's probably going to be 60, 50, 60, maybe 70%. But would I rather have 100% of bad data or 60% of good, high quality data? Yep, that's really what it comes down to.
That's a great point. Well, let's move on to mistake number 2. So, Danny, in your book and experience, kind of what would you say is the second biggest issue as it relates to exit interviews?
Yeah, and this mistake is tough for me because I think that when we have these webinars, when we do this is going to sound really self-serving, right? I mean, the Work Institute is in the business of outsourcing exit interviews for companies, and so it really sounds self-serving. But we, again, go back to the research, and the number 2 biggest mistake people make is who's actually doing the exit interview.
So the interviewer.
Yes, the interviewer. Most people, we're doing it internal most of the time. It's either HR, the supervisor, or again, we're using some sort of an electronic means to collect that data internally. The research, again, that we'll go back to says that if you're doing it externally, letting an outside unbiased third party conduct the exit interview, that 40 to 63% of the reasons for leaving are actually going to be different. And so we rely on that same research that was done. And by the way, the original research was done in like the 60s, but it's been updated over the years and validated over the years. We validated it ourselves here at the Work Institute. We have companies that have literally done exit interviews, and then we would go back and do exit interviews later, and we get that 40 to 50% of the reasons for leaving being different. So, I mean, it's just amazing to me. And the funny thing is that when I do a lot of speaking, Brantley, you know this, across the country, and I talk about this a lot in live audiences, and we'll talk about, tell me about why somebody might not be honest in an exit interview. And they'll go through all these things. Well, they don't want to tell their supervisor. They don't want to burn bridges. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do this. And I always ask, so why do we keep doing them the same way?
Keep repeating the same mistake.
The other thing that we talk about a lot is obviously the unbiased third party. Sorry to interrupt you, Brantley, but also how is it being conducted? This skilled interviewer. I mean, there's actually a skill set that's needed and necessary to conduct a really good exit interview. And that ability to be objective about it, but be able to probe and be able to understand things. And again, getting beyond just the reason for leaving, but getting to all the other things that we want to learn in an exit interview.
Yeah, having some intentionality behind the conversation.
Absolutely.
I've heard you talk about this a number of times, but you sitting or coming from the HR leader chair, I love it when you talk about the fact that, hey, I'm in HR. I'm Danny from HR. Everybody loves me. They're going to tell me the truth. And they might love you, but it doesn't mean they're going to air all their dirty laundry with you just because they're on their way out.
I see it all the time. We just have this sense of, maybe it's our ego, maybe it's whatever it is, but we just think that they're going to be honest with us. And sometimes they are.
Sure.
And sometimes we have those relationships. But people on the way out keep in mind that leaving a job and going to another job is a high stress time period. It's like one of those top 5 stressors that we have. And regardless of whether it was a positive departure, a negative departure, whatever the case may be, there's just a lot going on. And so I think when we think we can sit down on that last day of employment or that day before and conduct an exit interview, that we're going to get all this great information, it's going to be accurate, it's going to be valid. I just think we're asking a lot, and I think we have to give the person time, which is the number one mistake. And then number two, can we create a scenario where we've got an unbiased third party who's going to be completely disassociated with the company in a way that they can ask objective questions, ask probing questions, and get to the real root of what's going on and what are the opportunities for improvement, as well as the strengths. We can never forget strengths.
Right.
There are so many good things that are reinforcing in exit interviews that we learn that are really good about our organizations, and those are things that we have to celebrate.
Okay, so one final here is we'll also tell you that nothing should take the place of an offboarding meeting, right? So you still need to have this meaningful conversation with the employee about what's going to happen next. I know that's probably baked into most of your procedures and policies, but that still needs to happen. And in that case, if you're going to have a third party do a follow-up, like Danny said earlier, that's kind of where you tee up that communication.
Yeah, and I would also say that in that offboarding conversation, if you want to do some type of abbreviated exit interview. In fact, I hear some companies say, well, I use that exit interview to see if there's, anything we can do to keep them. Okay, well, have that conversation. Have that conversation to see if you can turn things around at that moment. Or, if just asking the simple question, is there anything you want to tell me about your experiences here or about why you're leaving? So I think giving them some type of opportunity to give you some feedback is perfectly fine. But I think introducing them then to this outside third-party objective exit interview that's going to be done a couple of weeks later, that's part of that offboarding conversation and part of what we communicate to them. And then it frees them up to be very truthful and objective when they do that exit interview a couple of weeks later.
Okay, sounds good. So on to mistake number 3, Danny. What is the number 3 mistake you see in the exit interview realm?
So Brantley, when we were practicing for this a little bit last week, and by the way, our practice was on a drive back from Birmingham, Alabama, as we were driving down the road talking through this a little bit. But this one is sort of the toughest one to me, and it gets down to the questions that we're asking. And a couple of things strike me. The first one is we oftentimes actually constrain what we can learn, okay? And there's a scientific term that I'm drawing a blank on, but it's the kind of restricting what we can learn, because we ask a lot of questions that are very, very specific, and we ask them as like rating questions. So we ask them to rate their supervisor's support. We ask them to rate the supervisor and their communication. We ask them, so we'll ask 2 or 3 things about the supervisor. Well, what if none of those things were the things that were an issue? So we constrain ourselves with what we can learn when we're just asking rating questions and we're not asking these broader open-ended questions. And that starts with the reason for leaving. We see it over and over and over again where we have, and this is especially true with online surveys, is that we'll have like 12 reasons, and you have to check which of these reasons, and some allow you to check more than one, and it'll say, well, which of the following were reasons why you left? And they may give career, and they may give personal reasons, and they may give something else, but it really restrains what we can learn when we limit them.
Sure.
And one of the things that we found out is there are like 50 distinctly different reasons why people leave. Now, are there, the top, whatever it is, 10 make up 60 or 70% of them. We get that. We understand that. But we can really learn some things from the other. But I think where the learning really comes is when it goes back to, I mentioned career earlier. Well, career as a topic is really interesting because what we see in our research is that there's kind of 2 really distinctive things related to career. One, I left because I didn't see where my next opportunity was going to be. So it's about promotion. It's about succession. The other one is about learning and developing in my job. So those are 2 very distinctly career-related issues that we have to address in 2 very different ways. But if we only learn that it's a career issue, we don't know what to do ultimately if we look at the very detailed root cause issues. So we create these constraints, but we also don't create the opportunity to probe for the specificity. And I know that's a word you use all the time, Brantley,
Yeah.
that specificity word, to get to what do we need to act on? What do we need to do? We ask too many questions. Sometimes they're just yes, no, true, false.
Well, and I think the too many is a product of the constraints.
Yeah.
Because you have to ask, because you're asking pointed questions, you feel like you have to ask more of them to cover more topics.
No doubt about it. And, you know, and again, it grits into the outsourcing, and I think we might talk about this a little bit, but, you know, that ability to organize that data, right?
Sure.
And so that's one of the things that an outside third party is very good at being able to do, is organizing that qualitative data. But that's where the richness comes from. That's where the real actionability comes from. And some of the questions are, you know, if for those of you that have done any study and survey development, you know, you get the double-barreled questions. You know, is something effective and efficient? All right. Well, effectiveness and efficiency are two completely different things, right? So
Yep.
you confuse the person, and you don't have a valid response because you've asked for two different things.
Yeah.
And those are, you know, just faulty question development. They can be leading questions. There's, you know, lack of consistency. All of those things can come up. So questions are one of the major issues, and it's one of the things. It doesn't have to be difficult. We typically are doing what, 6 to 10, 7 to 11 questions, something like that, but we're doing them open-ended. We're being able to probe. It doesn't take as long as you think. You'd think it would, an open-ended interview, you'd think it'd take 30 minutes. No, we can get a lot of information in like 12 to 15 minutes. And then there's consistency from interview to interview to interview, because that's one of the other things is we want to be able to understand, well, if we're doing an exit interview with people, you know, let's think of any of you in healthcare, right? If you're doing the exit interview for somebody in the emergency room versus someone in maternity, right? So let's figure out, was there consistency so we can compare that data and see if there's things that are going on that we need to be addressing.
Yeah, if you have a lot of very customized questions, you kind of lose sight of the big picture and being able to compare and contrast.
And especially going back to if you're doing them internally, right? So this HR person did this exit interview over here, this HR business partner did this exit interview over here. Was there consistency? Did they do it the same way?
Or the tools they use even the same.
Exactly.
Sure. Well, this is kind of oversimplifying it, and I know it's a little bit hokey, but when I really think about what you're trying to get at when you're doing these interviews and exit interviews or any kind of employee feedback, really, you are trying to lend the employee a voice, and you want that heard.
Yes.
So I think of this, and it's a real simple analogy, but it's the idea of, when do you learn the most? Do you learn the most by asking somebody, like if you were to just go, hey, Danny, would you rather go to Denver or Hawaii on vacation? Right? And you're going to go, oh, I'd rather go to Hawaii. Well, I'm going to be like, oh, well, Danny loves tropical weather and it's great. And he loves hanging out on the beach. Well, come to find out, you picked Hawaii maybe because you just had never been there. But you also love Colorado and you would love that too. Or do you gain a lot more insight and a lot more data by just simply asking, hey, Danny, if you could travel anywhere in the world for vacation, where would you want to go and why? Like, now we're learning. Now we're having a conversation. And
by the way, I want to go fishing in Alaska.
See, I would never have thought to include that in like a 5 to 10 question survey. That just wouldn't happen.
Yep.
But that's the difference between these closed-ended and open-ended questions. So we're going to move on to the fourth mistake here. And I know some questions are coming in. We'll try to answer those as we go. We might be able to kind of load them up and answer them at the end. But there is that chat and Q&A tool in Zoom. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to post those there.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and answer this one question because it's good timing. Lauren asked, would it be beneficial if we followed up with employees for an exit interview with someone in-house who doesn't interact with employees, such as an HR data and analytics specialist, or do you only suggest a third party? Well, again, I'm going to go back to this idea that, you know, what's practical, okay? So, you know, there are costs and things like that involved in outsourcing exit interviews, but we have seen a lot of companies that will set up an actual sort of internal group of people who are specifically trained to do things like exit interviews, and they will act as almost like a little mini call center, and they'll actually call former employees and follow up with them. Now, that's when you've got a lot of volume. That's for bigger companies. But to this person's point, yeah, I mean, if I can't outsource them, and especially if I've got a small organization, a lot of times we think of things in terms of bigger organization. I mean, our average size client's what, 5,000 employees or something like that. But if I'm a company of 50 people, and let's make it a little bigger, 100, 150 people, and I've got an HR department, I've got an HR person, maybe letting them, you know, if I've got a data person or benefits person or comp person that's not interacting with them all the time, maybe having them conduct that exit interview, call them a couple of weeks later, have some structure to it, have some open-endedness to it. But those are things that I would suggest are better. And it, you know,
They're improvements.
Yeah, it all boils down to, you know, there's the right way and the wrong way, and there's shades of gray all in the middle, right?
Sure.
And so, you know, and if anybody on this webinar has some questions and wants to talk to us and just have a conversation about what they're doing, by all means, call us, and we're happy to just chat and figure out if there's something we can do to be helpful to you.
All right, good deal. All right, so we're going to move on to mistake number 4 here. So, Danny, what's the number 4 mistake in making in conducting exit interviews?
Yeah, so the mistake number 4 is really an accumulation factor of the first 3. Okay, so we've talked about timing, we've talked about the interviewer, we've talked about the questions. So the number 4 mistake is related to reporting. Okay, and the challenge is that a lot of times when we're doing these disparate exit interviews, we're not doing them in a consistent way, we're not doing them in the right timing. We have all this data just floats around. It's either in an employee file somewhere, or it's in an Excel spreadsheet over here, or it's
10 Excel spreadsheets.
10 Excel spreadsheets. We've seen it all, that's for sure. But you've just got all of this myriad of information all over the place, and what we don't do is aggregate it. But it's also not organized in a way in the questionnaire and the questions that are being asked and the way that we deal with that data to then put it in a central repository and then have that repository start to tell us things, right? Because then it comes down to what are the trends, what are the most common reasons, what are the things that are happening, but also being cautious of not just looking at it from the perspective of what's going on for the entire organization, but what's going on in this area or with this particular employee. Again, I'm going to get back to some larger organizations, but one of the things we found going back to our retention report is that if I have 6 locations, the issues in location 5 are very likely to be different than the issues in location 2. Right? And it's this reporting of information that allows us to aggregate it together and then be able to understand what are those differences, what's going on there. So, you know, we either have all this disparate data that we're not doing anything with, or it's disorganized, or it's not aggregated. We have a lot of just assumptions that go on, right? And this is...
Yeah, well, because the byproduct of all those other things is this anecdotal stuff, right?
Correct.
I had 2 people in my office in the last week leave for pay, so now we got to increase everybody's pay. Well,
and we hear about this and we train on this in things like performance reviews, right? Everybody here on the call, I bet, has had some training around performance reviews, and we've heard of the recency effect, right? Yep. And so that recency effect actually occurs when it comes to exit interviews. So to your point, Brantley, the last 2 or 3 people all pulling into pay, so suddenly we are convinced we have a pay issue because that's what happened with the last 3 people.
Yeah, and without any aggregated or organized data, you don't have anything to disprove that.
That's right.
So,
yeah, so the reporting is a big thing. And again, I'm going to say that's an accumulation. If you're doing an outside third party, if you've got a company that does that sort of thing, that's just part of it, right? We organize all that information. We've got it organized in a meaningful way, and then we can report on trends. We can report on frequency. We can report on all the different slices and dices of different data. So reporting is definitely a big deal, and something that we need to pay attention to, and not just let this data collect dust. And again, I'm going to go back to that. Why are we doing exit interviews? And we're doing exit interviews. If you're not losing employees very much and turnover is not an issue for you, if you want to do them inside just to say you've done them and learned something, that's fine. My suspicion And of course, we live here. For those of you that don't know, we're based just outside Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville has got all of this it city kind of stuff. We've got Amazon moving in, and Alliance Bernstein moving in, and all these companies that are moving in, and jobs are being created like crazy. This is an extraordinarily competitive marketplace. So, you know, people are losing. They just don't know how to keep their employees, and there are help wanted signs everywhere. You guys can attest to that. So I believe that most companies are losing more employees than they want to lose. And if that's part of my drive for wanting to do an exit interview, that I need to do them right based on the timing, I need to have them done correctly, and this reporting becomes absolutely critical because of the next mistake that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and let me take this out of the exit interview world for just half a second.
Sure.
One thing that we find all the time, or I feel like we see often with our prospects and clients, is that they have a lot of data across the employee life cycle. They might have some form of onboarding feedback. They have some form of engagement study. They have some disparate data for exit interviews, but rarely have they sat down and looked at it across the spectrum. So not only can the data within exit interviews become siloed, but it becomes siloed across the employee life cycle. So when you're thinking of reporting, one thing we would encourage you to do is to figure out is how you have this data, how can you tie it together? And obviously a third party helps with that, because that's what they do, that's their wheelhouse. But chances are your organization has a couple of data points that aren't just exit interviews that you can start linking together.
Yeah, Brantley, now you're going to get me off on a tangent, but I can't help myself now, okay? And that is to, you know, I think and let me just say that the role of human resources, the job of the human resource professional has never been more challenging. It is a tough job. The demands that are on human resources in today's marketplace, the challenges that we have, the ability to attract workers, the ability to keep workers, to make them and help them be productive. It is a very, very, very challenging time. But one of the things that we've got to make sure that we're doing is doing things the right way. And now, where was I going with this? This is what happens when I go off the script. Is I forget where I was going.
We're talking about kind of the employee life cycle.
Yeah, thank you, Brantley. I appreciate that. So, you know, I think we're sometimes looking for, well, what's the one thing we can do? So do we just want to do stay interviews, or do we just want to do an engagement study? Are we doing onboarding? And the reality is that we need to have a very consistent life cycle voice of the employee going on across the life cycle. We suggest and recommend that there are three absolutely fundamental elements of a voice of the employee system. We need to be doing something in that onboarding phase, because the early stage is so critical. What is it? I think it was 38 or 39% of all turnover in 2018 was in the first year. So that early time is critical. Then we need to be doing some sort of a baseline study, whether you want to call it a satisfaction or climate assessment or engagement study, that once a year where we give everybody a voice, know where we're at, know what our baseline is, know whether we're getting better or getting worse. And then we need to be doing exit interviews with everybody so that we know why people are leaving, so we can address those issues. Those are those three fundamental elements. And then you can supplement them with things like stay interviews or pulse studies or some of those kinds of things. But we need to be doing at least those three things so that we are giving people a voice, but also giving them a voice across that life cycle, which is really, really important.
Okay.
Sorry, that was my one tangent, everybody.
No, I think I think that's good. Well, all right. So now on to our fifth and final mistake we're going to talk about in this session. So Danny, I'm going to let you tell us what that is.
Yeah, so this one, so again, I'm going to go back to our 2019 retention report. And that was the third year that we've put together a retention report. And again, I'm hopeful all of you are familiar with it. But what we do is we've got about 170 or 80 clients across the country in different industries with different types of jobs that they have within their company, and we take all of that exit data. We've got like 35 to 40,000 exit interviews, and we aggregate it all up, and we say, okay, well, what are the trends that are going on in the U.S. today as it relates to people leaving? And so we've done this for 3 years, and what we've seen is that there really hasn't been much change over the last 3 years, other than the fact that what we consider controllable reasons keep going up and the uncontrollable things keep going down. So the things that companies can control, the things that are more preventable, things like career issues and manager issues and work-life balance issues, those are things that we can typically do something about, and it doesn't look like anybody's doing anything. And so that number 5 mistake is all around taking action. Now, I have talked to so many companies over the years about this particular topic because I think it's not easy. Taking action related to retention first of all, it has to be very intentional. You have to be intentional about what am I taking action on and why am I taking action. And by the way, one of the things, and again, I hope this doesn't get us derailed, but I'm starting to talk to a lot of companies who are saying, I've got high engagement and I have high turnover. And those two things can exist to some degree. Now, I start to question our engagement products, and that's another topic for another day. But those things are troubling to folks. And so one of the things that we need to do is to determine, is retention something that we need to work on? And then we have to be very intentional about that as its own sort of action plan, its own set of strategies. And the exit interviews become a central part of that strategy because, again, it's a predictive analytic. So what we're finding is that companies struggle with it. And I think the reason they struggle is because exit interviews, as most of you know, sort of never end. If we're doing an engagement study, we're doing an engagement study on, May 15th through the 30th. And so there's this very time-bound project that we're doing where we get the data, we analyze the data, and then we build action plans around that. Exit interviews are always going on. People leave every day or every week or every month. And so this ongoing, and so the data is constantly updating and constantly changing. And I think this gives people fits in terms of feeling like, well, we have to get to this stopping point or we have to get to this certain place. Well, we just have to decide we're going to act, and we have to decide how often are we going to look at our data, how often are we going to analyze that data, which goes back to about the reporting thing in number 4. So we have to have data that we can rely on. And then we need to be able to say, well, every 6 months, we're going to gather as much information as we can related to retention. We're going to focus on that. And we're going to build action plans. Now, one of the things that we suggest is saying, well, let's go look at where the worst areas of turnover is, and let's focus there. So not even the entire organization always has to be building action plans. It can be very targeted around specific jobs, specific managers, specific locations. And that's the way you really drill into this idea around acting as it relates to retention.
Well, you say this all the time, and I think this is such a valuable piece of advice when we're thinking about how to tackle this, is follow the money.
Yeah.
So wherever the turnover is the worst or the most painful to recruit, maybe, well, whatever the case may be, and it can be different for every organization and potentially location even, is follow that money. Where is it hurting you the most, and start acting there.
Absolutely. And again, I'm going to go back to it's typically a location, or it's typically a particular job title, or it's a a particular department, or whatever the case may be. And those are things that we can get very focused on. But we need to be doing them collectively, exit interviews for the entire organization, because we never know where the next issue is going to be. And we also want to be doing them ongoing because, again, I'm going to go back to this predictive analytic conversation and say that if we're acting appropriately and we're acting on the reasons for leaving, one of the things you're going to see is those reasons for leaving will change over time. In fact, we got a great case study with Cincinnati Children's Hospital where they were tracking things that were controllable versus non-controllable, and they saw a significant shift in those reasons around controllable versus non-controllable as they were acting on the data. And so that's one of the big things that we can focus on. But taking action is the biggest, one of those huge mistakes, is that we let the data sit around and collect dust and never do anything.
Okay, and I feel like we have this conversation on a pretty consistent basis with folks. I'll also say that while following the money is absolutely critical and the best starting place, just doing something, getting the ball rolling is kind of the biggest first step.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I would point out there, Brantley, is that, we can have let's just say, and it doesn't turn out very often that pay is the big issue, but maybe we've done all of our exit data and we find out that pay is the number one issue and that 30 or 40% of our people are leaving because of pay. Yeah. Well, guess what? We may not be able to do anything about pay. We may have budget constraints, competitive landscape constraints, all of those things there that we can't do anything about. But guess what? The number two reason is manager behavior. Right. Guess what? 10% of our people left because of their manager. 10%, we're like, oh, well, it's only 10%. Well, that talk about following the money, 10%, if it's 10% of 1,000 people, well, that's 100 folks. And if we can reduce that by just, 10, right? That's like $150,000 with the average departure cost of turnover around 15 grand. So we can make an impact, and it isn't just about taking on that number one reason. It might be taking on number 3 or number 5. What are the things that we can act on? What are the things we can control? What are the things that we can do? And that really gets down to this action plan component.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. We've gone through the top 5 mistakes made in exit interviews. So this what right looks like slide, it acts as kind of an introduction to our next webinar. That's going to be on August 23rd. And the topic's going to be our Work Institute's exit interview services. So we're going to do a deeper dive into what we do and how we do it. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit more direct. We kind of view this one as informational, and then we'll take a deeper dive in the next one into our approach and why we use that approach. Also, we're going to leave it open here for just half a second for any additional questions, concerns, comments. If you want to send those to us via the comment tool or the Q&A. But pretty soon you all should be seeing the invite for that next webinar coming out soon.
Yeah, and I want to go back to that topic just a little bit. And, again, when we're doing this and I'm doing presentations and things, it always feels a little self-serving. But, one of the things that I admire about the Work Institute, and I've been here for, 9.5 years or something like that. And so maybe I've been indoctrinated, but I've just always been impressed. I was always impressed when I met the company. By the way, I used to be a client. I was a client of the Work Institute before I came to work here. And I became a client because they sat down with me and gave me the research. They gave me the real reasons, and they helped me to understand what it meant to do things on an evidence basis. And what did the research say? And we went back to that research and looked at it and said, oh, well, this is the way to properly do an exit interview. And so I just think that that's so important. So I know that it sounds self-serving, but for those of you that are struggling with exit interviews, I think it's worthy of coming to this next webinar. Yes, it's a sales webinar. That's exactly what it is. We're in the business of selling our services, but we're also in the business of truly trying to help companies become better places to work. That's our mission. That is our objective. And you have in this organization a lot of people that are very, very passionate about helping other companies become great places to work, because that's what it's all about. We spend so much of our time at work. Let's make it the best experience it can be. So that is really what drives us, and one of the things that I'm really proud about here. So
I think that's all very well said. So you'll be getting a follow-up email from this with the recording of this webinar as well as the presentation. We're also going to include a link to register for the next one, and we hopefully look forward to seeing a lot of you all, if not all of you, on the next webinar on August 23rd. Look forward to hearing from you all. In the meantime, if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.